right, this is on. Let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have to come together and study. Be with those that are still on their way, and just ask that you be with those who might not be here for other reasons, Father, be it sickness or just anything that is preventing them from being here, for that they might be able to be with us at the next appointed time. Help us to have clear minds and hearts as we enter into this time of study so that we might be able to absorb into our hearts the things we have to learn from your word. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, Lamentations chapter 5. We're nearing the end of our study of this book, but what we know from verse 1 of this book is that Jeremiah is asking God to remember the things that the Jewish people are going through and their suffering as a result of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, more in that context, in verses 12 through 16 of this chapter, Jeremiah gives examples of the Jewish people who are suffering. He really began this back in verse 7 of this chapter, but that continues on into verses 12 through 16. And in verses 12 through 16, he makes 3 points about what happened to the people of Jerusalem after it was destroyed. And he gets into 3 specific groups of people here in verses 12 through 16. So since that's true, there's 3 points. First of all, it's the Jewish authorities. They lost their respect at the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 13, he gets more into the youth of Jerusalem and says that they were enslaved. And finally, the third point Jeremiah makes in verses 14 through 16 is that the Jewish people lost their joy at the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, after looking at these things, what we'll learn from these verses is that sin can bring suffering, because one thing we know about the destruction of Jerusalem is that it was very much brought on by the sins of the Jewish people. So let's read verses 12 through 16, and then we'll look at the points. Again, this is Lamentations chapter 5, beginning in verse 12. The text says, "Princes were hung by their hands, elders were not respected, young men worked at the grinding mill, and youth stumbled under loads of wood. Elders are gone from the gate, young men from their music. The joy of our hearts has ceased, our dancing has been turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Because of this, our heart is faint." I skipped a line. "Woe to us, for we have sinned. The heart is faint," begins verse 17, but we're not dealing with verse 17 today. So again, Jeremiah gets into 3 groups of people here. First of those is the Jewish authorities, and that's beginning in verse 12. We read about the princes. Does everyone have the word princes there at the beginning of verse 12? Yeah. Okay. So we read about these princes. Now, what do we usually associate when we hear about princes? Royalty. So here's where we begin to see that the royalty is part of the ones who are suffering. According to this first line of verse 12, what happened to the princes? Hung up by their hands. So what's happening to them? What was happening, I should say? They're being tortured. Tortured, and I mean, Don's right. It would be uncomfortable, but that's not the point Jeremiah is making here. So yeah, they're being tortured. It's just they're hung up by their hands, tortured, and that probably ended in their execution. But this is one of the highest forms of authority in Jerusalem that this is happening to. So with that in mind, we go on to the second line where it says the elders were not respected. Who are these elders? Can somebody tell me about that? Might be the elders of the synagogues. Might say the elders of the families and tribes. Now, these were also, Go ahead, Andrea. They were leaders. So this is also dealing with people in authority. At this time, the elders were very much respected. They were seen as forms of authority. Some of them might be forms of authority in the synagogue, but elders, as Andrea put it, were leaders. So what did they lose according to the second line of verse 12? The respect of the people. So they're not receiving this respect. Another word for respect there might be honor. And so formerly they were honored. Now, why would elders have been honored? Their wisdom. That's exactly right. It's their wisdom and their experience is why they were honored as old men. So putting these things together, the point we should see from this verse about what happened to the people of Jerusalem is that Jewish authorities lost their respect. The princes were hung by their hands. That's the way they were very much being shown they were not respected. The Jewish elders were not receiving the honor that they deserved for being who they were. And the result of these things then would be that social and the religious structure of the Jewish people would have been completely fallen apart. Any questions or comments on verse 12? Okay, there's some truth to that, and that gets into a little bit of application here. Is just the elderly are not as respected as they once were. All the focus today is on youth. Elaine? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. That's true. So yeah, and a lot of this has to do with their sin. All that has led to this, and so yes, society is basically falling apart. Is part of the idea behind these things. Anything else on verse 12? All right. Let's go to verse 13, the second group of people that Jeremiah addresses, and that is what the New American Standard calls the young men. Does anyone have a different term than young men there? No. Okay. So who are the young men? Not the elders. Okay. Yeah. So, somebody in probably my category of people. I'm approaching 40, which is still kind of surreal for me. I'll be 40 next year. But yes, still in this day and age, even a 40-year-old would be considered a young man. But what does Jeremiah say here? What are they doing? The young men. We'll look at the word youths in a minute. What's that? Is that the word you have, mill stand? Okay, the American Standard has grinding mill. So, grinding mill, mill stand, whatever you have, this is where they're working, the text says. Now, can anyone tell me what a mill stand or a grinding mill is? It's where they grind wheat. Okay, so it's that position. So with that information in mind, something we should understand here is that working at the grinding mill in the Jewish cultural context, that was a job normally reserved for prisoners and or slaves at this time. Now, if you know something about the Jewish cultural context, slaves and prisoners were at the bottom of the totem pole, the proverbial totem pole. These young men, under normal circumstances, would not be there. They'd be working some more of the quote-unquote higher class kinds of jobs. But now they're working at these mill stands, as your translation reads, Dean. So what does that tell us? What's happening to these young men? They're getting treated poorly. They've gotten demoted. That's the one way to put it. So yeah, they're being reduced to the position of a slave or even a prisoner, because there was some imprisonment happening at this time. Yeah, that would also be true. No, that's all been taken away from them. So yeah, they're not landowners, they're now prisoners and slaves. So with that in mind, the second line of this verse moves to youths. It's similar to the young men, but the young men are more the, as I said, 20 to 40-year-olds, just using some rough numbers there. Now we have the youths. What's the difference between youths and young men? We might say teenagers. Maybe even going lower than that, to small children. What does the text say is happening with them? And how are they moving them around? Must be on their backs. That is probably correct here. So it's these young men, anywhere from children up to teenage years. They're being forced to carry this wood, probably on their backs. But again, that job, like the grinding mill or mill stand, was also reserved for slaves or prisoners. But now you have possibly kids Jenny's age that are being forced to do this. Forced labor. That's exactly the good term for it. And so kids that size can't really carry large loads of wood on their backs. So that's what's happening. They're staggering, stumbling under this, but they're still being forced to do this. So putting these things together, looking at this group of people, young people were enslaved after the destruction of Jerusalem. So this is part of their suffering. One reason they were suffering is because they were being forced to do a slave's or a prisoner's work. As a result, these youths, these young men, became no better than a slave or a prisoner under these circumstances. Anything else on verse 13? All right. Well, now we move into the last group, which kind of encompasses everybody, and that's the Jewish people. They lost their joy at the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, one reason this seems to encompass all the people is because the elders come back into view and other people come back into view. But now here in verse 14, we're given some more information both about the elders and the young men. What does verse 14 tell us? Elders no longer gather at the gate. What about the young men? No music. So this is the information we're presented with. So with that in mind, something else we should understand here first about the elders is that the elders, what used to be happen is that they'd gather at the gate. The city gate is what this gate is about. They'd carry on business. They'd be talking with people coming in and out of the city gates of Jerusalem. That's no longer happening. And now we have the young men from their music. Now, what do we usually associate with music and people? Dancing, happiness, merriment's a good word. So something else that was normally happening in Jerusalem was you'd see these young men playing music, having a good time. That's not happening anymore because the city has been destroyed. Its enemies have come in and taken over, and they've stopped all these things from happening. So that's verse 14. Any questions or comments? All right. So verse 15, Jeremiah now includes himself in this statement. The text says, "The joy of our hearts has ceased. Our dancing has been turned into mourning." Now, does everyone have the word joy there? Okay. What's joy? Happiness. When you have joy in your heart, you're happy. Well, what's happened to the people's joy? It's gone. It's gone. And you have stopping? Cease. Okay. How does it mean when something ceases? You guys just said it. It stops. They no longer have this joy in their hearts. And then, as a result of these things, it says our dancing has been turned into mourning. So, what do we usually associate with dancing, especially based on the first line? Yeah, exactly. Celebrations, joy, happy times is what Pam said. What's that been turned into? Mourning. What's mourning? That's true. That was the outward expression of mourning. But here Jeremiah is talking about what's going on the level of their hearts. I mean, the outward expression would be there. But what's mourning? Sadness. So it builds on this idea of the joy has ceased. And the outward expression of that joy, one way, would be dancing. But now that joy has ended, and now there's these feelings of sadness that are taking over their hearts because of what's going on. Now, what's our heart? As Jeremiah is using it in this verse, it's our mind, that unseen part of ourselves. So this is affecting them down to the very core. All this that's gone on because of the destruction of Jerusalem. Anything else in verse 15? That's true. Okay. Yeah, when the Bible talks about joy, it's not always dependent on the outward circumstances. It's that it comes from the attitude that we have because of our relationship with God. But that has ended for these people. Because one thing Jeremiah has talked about, including in this chapter, is just he feels like God has forgotten them. And so if you feel like God has forgotten you, that you lose hope, but you also lose some joy in the process. And that's how Jeremiah is feeling in this book, is that God has left them. Now, closer to the end of the chapter, he'll ask some questions about whether or not this is going to go on forever, but we'll get there at another time. Anything else on verse 15? Sandy? Okay, that is also a joyful circumstance. Anything else on verse 15? All right, let's go to verse 16. Kind of summarizes what's been said so far. He says, the text says, the crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. So getting into this verse, we see that Jeremiah is using the image of a crown that has fallen in order to emphasize the fact that he and his fellow Jews have sinned. Now, what comes to our mind when we see the word crown? King, royalty. So Jeremiah is using that image in this verse. But what does it symbolize when the crown falls from the head? They might say they're no longer has power. Any other ideas? They might say not in charge. So that's part of the idea here. But another image behind the crown is a crown is usually something very beautiful. One thing we've looked at here in Lamentations is that the city of Jerusalem, before it was destroyed, had a lot to be proud of. It was a great city. People said, wow, Jerusalem's a great place. It had a crown, in a manner of speaking, because of that fact. But now Jeremiah says the crown has fallen. What made the city of Jerusalem proud is now gone. Yeah, that would be part of it. Yeah, that would be. Uh-huh. Exactly. Right. That's why you can say this is kind of an all-encompassing statement. Everything they had, gone. Well, why? Jeremiah says, because we've sinned. That's true. I think that's right. Yeah. I'm not recalling it right now. I'd have to go back and look at my. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not remembering the exact king. Let me see if I have it somewhere here. Oh, I don't have it here immediately in front of me. I'd have to go back and look. Was it Manasseh? Okay. Okay. I'm not as familiar with the kings as I probably should be, but you might be right, Dad. Um, so this is what Jeremiah is saying. The crown has fallen from our head. Everything that made them proud, gone. But he says, woe to us, for we have sinned. Now, can anyone tell me what that phrase, woe to us, is about? It's like, oh, pity us. It's a statement of realization. You're in a very bad circumstance. Why are the people of Jerusalem in a bad circumstance? Because they sinned. They've lost everything. Quite literally, everything. So Jeremiah makes this statement. He's including himself here. He doesn't excuse himself from the guilt of sin. I mean, he's been the prophet, but he's part of these people. So big picture, he is also guilty of these sins because he's among those who are suffering. And that's why something else that occurred to me when I was reading some of this stuff is when God brings his judgment on his people, even the faithful feel the effects. And so that's why Jeremiah includes himself here, because he's also feeling the effects of God's judgment. He's also suffering in all of this. Maybe not to the same extent, but he's still suffering in all of this. And that's why he uses the crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, for we have sinned. We shouldn't gloss over that. Those small, tiny words are important. They're all there for a reason. Anything else on verse 16? Yeah. Absolutely. It was Zedekiah. Okay, I was like, I know it was a, yeah. Anything else on verse 16? All right. So putting verses 14 through 16 together, it's an all-encompassing point about the Jewish people, and that's that they lost their joy at the destruction of Jerusalem. So at the destruction of Jerusalem, another thing people lost was their joy that we've been talking about. They lost their happiness. They lost their joy because their elders were no longer being seen at the city gates. They lost their joy because their young men were no longer being heard making music. And as a result, the joy was turned into sadness, and it's something that caused them to mourn instead of dance because of all the shameful circumstances they were in as a result of their sins against God. So putting verses 12 through 16 of this chapter, just boiling it down to one point, is that the Jewish people suffered after the destruction of Jerusalem. The Jewish authorities lost their respect, the Jewish youth were enslaved, and the Jewish people as a whole lost their joy. That's all suffering circumstances. So an application of this that we should be left with is that sin brings suffering. Sin can cause us to suffer. Now, the fact that sin is something that could cause us to suffer is seen in the fact that Jeremiah acknowledges that the reason he and his people are suffering is because of their sins against God. These verses should also help us to realize that if we want to avoid unnecessary suffering, we must avoid unnecessary sin. And if we do that, then we'll be living our lives in a way that is more pleasing to God. Dean? That's a good saying. So, anything else on these verses? All right. Dad, will you close us today?